Nobody in the family thought twice about old Margaret. At 78 years old, she was quiet, soft-spoken, and always sitting in the same worn-out armchair by the living room window. She spent her mornings watering the flowers in the garden and her evenings knitting blankets for her grandchildren, most of whom never even called anymore. To everyone else, Grandma Margaret was simply an old woman living with her eldest son, Richard, because she had nowhere else to go. At least, that's what they believed. Richard and his wife, Carol, often complained about having to take care of her. "Your mother doesn't contribute anything," Carol would whisper loudly enough for Margaret to hear. "She just sits around all day. We could turn that room into an office." Margaret never argued. She would simply smile and quietly return to her knitting. But what nobody knew was that she was listening to every cruel word. The family had changed after Grandpa died. While he was alive, everyone gathered for Sunday dinners and birthdays. But after his funeral, kindness disappeared. Conversations became arguments, and love was replaced by greed. The biggest reason? The house. It was a beautiful two-story home with a huge garden, sitting on nearly 2 acres of land. Property values in the neighborhood had exploded over the years, and people whispered that the house was worth over $2 million. Richard constantly told everyone, "Dad left the house to me. After all, I'm the oldest." No one ever questioned him. Margaret certainly didn't. One evening, Richard invited the whole family over. His younger brother, Michael, and his sister, Linda, arrived with their spouses. The discussion quickly turned into a heated argument about money. "We need to sell the house," Carol insisted. "We're struggling with bills, and this place is too big." Linda crossed her arms. "If you sell it, we deserve our share too." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "What share? I've been taking care of Mom all these years." Margaret quietly sat in the corner, watching her own children fight over a house that none of them had ever worked for. Then Carol looked directly at her. "This wouldn't even be a problem if your mother wasn't still living here." The room fell silent. Richard took a deep breath before saying something that would change all of their lives. "Mom, maybe it's time you moved into a retirement home." Margaret looked up slowly. "A retirement home? It's for the best," Carol interrupted. "You'll have people your own age around you, and we can finally move on with our lives." Margaret glanced around the room, hoping at least one of her children would defend her. Nobody spoke. Not Michael. Not Linda. Not a single grandchild. She smiled sadly, stood up, and quietly walked to her bedroom. The next morning, she packed one small suitcase. As she reached the front door, she turned around and looked at the family photos hanging on the wall. There was a picture of her and her late husband building that very home with their own hands almost 50 years earlier. She touched the frame gently. "I hope one day," she whispered, "you all learn what really matters." Then she walked away. A local church volunteer helped Margaret find a small apartment across town. It wasn't much, a tiny one-bedroom flat, but for the first time in years, she felt peace. Meanwhile, Richard and Carol wasted no time making changes. They cleared out her room, repainted the walls, and contacted a real estate agent about selling the property. The agent arrived a week later. After touring the house, he smiled and said, "This place will sell quickly. I just need to verify ownership before we list it." Richard laughed. "No problem. It belonged to my father." The agent frowned. "I'm sorry, according to the property records, your father wasn't the owner." Richard's smile disappeared. "What do you mean?" The agent looked down at his tablet. "The sole legal owner of this property is Margaret Wilson." The room went completely silent. Carol grabbed the tablet from his hands. "That can't be right." But it was. Years ago, when Richard's father had started a risky business, he had transferred the house into Margaret's name to protect the family if anything ever went wrong. After his death, the title had remained exactly where he had left it. The house had never belonged to Richard. It had always belonged to Grandma. Panic spread through the family. Richard called his mother over and over again, but she never answered. Linda and Michael suddenly remembered how much they missed Mom. The grandchildren started sending flowers and apologetic messages. A week later, Margaret finally agreed to meet them. They gathered in the old family home, the very place they had forced her to leave. Richard stepped forward first. "Mom, we're sorry. We made a mistake." Carol forced a smile. "We just thought it would be easier for everyone." Margaret looked at each of them carefully. Then she asked one simple question. "If you had never discovered the house was mine, would you still have come looking for me?" Nobody answered. Because they all knew the truth. Margaret reached into her handbag and pulled out a folder. "I've spent the last week speaking with my lawyer," she said calmly. Richard's face turned pale. "I've decided to sell the house." Carol suddenly smiled. "That's wonderful. We can finally." Margaret raised her hand. "You misunderstand me." She opened the folder and slid a document across the table. "I'm selling the house, and every penny is being donated." "What?" Richard shouted. Margaret looked him straight in the eyes. "There are hundreds of elderly people sleeping alone every night because their own families abandoned them. I'm creating a foundation in your father's memory to build a home for them." Linda burst into tears. "You can't do that. We're your family." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "Family isn't defined by blood. Family is the people who stay beside you when you have nothing to offer them." 3 months later, the old house was sold. The money funded the opening of the Wilson House, a beautiful community center and residence for lonely senior citizens who had nowhere else to go. Margaret moved into a small apartment attached to the center, surrounded by people who appreciated her kindness. One afternoon, as she watered the flowers outside, a little girl from the neighborhood ran up and hugged her. "Grandma Margaret," she shouted. Margaret smiled with tears in her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt truly at home. As for Richard, Carol, and the rest of the family, they drove past the old property one last time, only to find a sign standing where their childhood home once stood. It read, "Built with love. Dedicated to every grandparent who was forgotten, but never stopped loving." And that was the day they realized they hadn't just lost a house. They had lost the only person